Okay, so this is a paper about government debt in Japan, and anyway, what we want to do is kind of focus on two significant challenges that Japan faces. One is that they have a very high debt-to-output ratio. I say here close to 150%, or it's getting close to 150%. This is the net debt to output. Sometimes you'll see gross debt to output quoted, and that's going to even be much higher. They also face, so not only they have this debt that they have to pay off, but there are huge projected increases in government expenditures due to aging population. In particular, estimates I'll talk about later, about 7% of output, there'll be increase in spending about 7% of output by 2050. And so that has to be financed. And so what we want to kind of do in this paper is to explore the size and consequences of possible fiscal responses to these challenges. So here's the net debt to GMP. It's just been growing at a very, very high pace since the mid-90s, and or actually the early 90s, and is projected to, this is the net debt to output again, and net debt to GMP, and is approaching, well, it's already past levels that I think historically people would have thought of as not feasible. How would you ever even finance that kind of debt? But Japan has had no problem doing that. And this shows a bit about the aging. So if you look at the red line is just the number of people 65 and over divided by the dependency ratio. So it's a number of people 65 and older divided by those of age 21 to 64. And you see that increasing from the present up through about 2070, and then it's going to stay pretty flat for a while. It'll come down eventually, obviously, but that's a long ways off. The last date on that graph is 2100. So these are projections of these dependency ratios. I mentioned that there have been forecasts of how much all this aging is going to cost. And what are the main costs here are going to be costs associated with health expenditures for these old people and pensions. And so in Japan, the pensions would come under the category of transfers. And this paper by Fukawa and Sato estimate that transfers to output will increase by about, I think, 4% from 2010 to 2050 due to these pension obligations. Health expenditures come under government spending, government consumption, and that's expected to increase about 3% from 2010 to 2050. Okay, so what we're going to actually do is to formulate and calibrate a neoclassical growth model of Japan, and then use that model to calculate the effects of alternative fiscal policies that would be designed to achieve some fiscal balance in face of these these projected increases in expenditures. In particular, we want to know how large taxes need to rise in order to both retire the debt. I should have said this already, but we're presuming at some point debt reaches a point where you can't finance any more debt. You've got to start paying it down, and you also have to be able to finance these increased expenditures. What's that going to require? How are they going to be able to achieve that? And what we'll do first is we'll try to get a handle on that by just thinking, well, if we did it by reducing transfers, or you could think of that as like a lump sum tax, how big would that reduction have to be in order to achieve fiscal balance? And then later, we'll consider how distorting taxes would affect that. And these will be distorting taxes. In other words, we're going to have elastic labor in the model, and so these increases in taxes will have real effects on how much is produced and how much people work. The methodology that we're going to follow is Well, from Hayashi and Prescott in their analysis of the 1990s in Japan, and also Chen Imrahoro and Imrahoro, who looked at Japanese savings rate, movements in this Japanese savings rate using a very similar methodology. What is this methodology? Okay, economic agents have perfect foresight. They know what's going to happen in the future. And what you do is you take all exogenous variables as given, and you try to measure them in the data over the period that you observe, which for us will be 1981 through 2010. Those exogenous variables are going to be TFP, tax rates, government consumption, transfers, and also population levels. And then we'll use the model to forecast those exogenous variables. I mean, not the model, but we'll use forecasts of those exogenous variables from 2011 and beyond in order to be able to project what's going to happen in the endogenous variables beyond that point. In particular, we'll introduce the projections of government expenditures from the Fukawa and Sato that I just put in the previous slide, and also government projections of population changes up to 2050. Okay. Okay, so the model is going to be one in which government debt is modeled, and the price of bonds or the interest rate on government debt is going to be endogenous and determined by the model. And what we're going to do to try to get the level of returns correct is we're going to actually put bonds in the utility function. Interest rates are very low in Japan, even though debt is very, very high. So the way we're modeling is that Japanese really, and it's mostly domestically held. I mean, Japanese debt is held by Japanese. So these guys like this. And that's the way we're going to get the rate of return and dominance that we observe there. And we're going to have an endogenous, I said before, endogenous labor choice that will mean, that these consumption and labor taxes that we're going to be experimenting with will be distorting. And then our model will have what we'll call a fiscal sustainability rule, which guarantees that the debt is ultimately paid off. So the idea is that how do we guarantee that the government's intertemporal budget constraint is satisfied? We'll have a way of doing that. Okay. Okay, there's some previous papers that my co-author Sello and Mahorlu and now Sudo did on Japan using the neoclassical growth model, although they were looking at a model with no debt and basically, with debt, but no margins other than just capital accumulation. And but anyway, in particular, I want to mention that now Sudo is responsible for all the Japanese data. So fortunately, he's not here. So he's helped us with that. Mainly, we're using the data from the previous papers. Okay, so let me describe a bit the model, and so. The government budget. So that's kind of a key. This is a very simple model, very simple neoclassical growth model. I'm basically going to have just 4 slides showing what's going on here. But the idea is that we have a government. The government is buying output. It's consuming. It's transferring. That's mainly the pensions that we're talking about, and it's having to pay back some debt. It issues debt. A to T, by the way, is just the growth rate of population. So all these capital letter variables are per capita. Okay, these are in per capita terms. And so that's why there's a growth rate here. This is the price of bonds. And so, they'll sell it at a small discount. And they'll get revenue from consumption taxes, revenue from labor taxes. There'll be a capital tax rate, and so they'll get revenue from capital income net of depreciation. And in addition, they get revenue from taxing the interest that people make on the government bonds, holding the government bonds. Okay? Fiscal sustainability rule. Okay? Here's the idea. There's this indicator. This indicator will be 0 or 1. When's it 1? When the bond to output ratio reaches some trigger. We just choose that. I mean, this is, our model is silent on what that should be, so that's just a parameter of the model. It'd be great to have a model that told you how much debt Japan could actually issue and get funded. We don't have such a model, so this is just a parameter. And once that debt to output trigger is hit, then you got to start paying back some fraction kappa of the debt. So kappa is going to be a parameter, and B bar is going to be the per capita debt level along a steady state balanced growth path. And so you have to pay back some of that debt, at least in our initial way of thinking about this. Transfers will be reduced by the amount of debt that has, the value of the debt that has to be retired. On the household side, okay, as I mentioned, so this is a infinite horizon type neoclassical growth model. NT is population. People care about consumption. These are balanced growth preferences. They dislike working, and psi there would be the Frisch labor supply elasticity, and they care about bond holdings, okay? They get utility from bond holdings. There's this sort of shift parameter which we need for reasons I'll mention a little bit later, but effectively you can think of that as representing maybe other kinds of assets that we haven't modeled that are substitutes for government debt, that give the same kind of utility as government debt may give, okay? And then the household's budget constraint, after, you know, they spend on consumption, they have to pay their taxes on the consumption, they accumulate capital, they save in the form of government debt, they have after-tax labor income, after-tax capital income, and you know, they get the interest on the debt that they held that they took into the period from the previous period. Of course, they have to pay some taxes on that interest. And they receive a transfer from the government. On the firm side, absolutely standard Cobb-Douglas neoclassical kind of technology. Total output, so remember these things are per capita, so that's total output is going to be a Cobb-Douglas total amount of labor, and then this is total factor productivity, which is one of our driving variables, one of our exogenous variables. Capital stock depreciates at the rate delta, and the total factor productivity grows over time. We actually have observations. That's why there's a T subscript there on the gamma. We have observations on the growth rate of TFP during our sample period. Beyond the sample period, we don't have, you know, we're just going to assume a constant growth rate beyond that. Okay. All right, so then this is just sort of what we do. We transform, we detrend everything by dividing by this, by TFP effectively. And so every capital letter variable, which was per capita but growing due to technological progress, becomes a lowercase version of the same letter that won't be trending, okay? And what we end up with from the first order conditions of the problems that we talked about, we can get basically 10 equations and 10 unknowns. And then from a computational perspective, what we have to do is basically find the path that satisfies a transversality condition on capital. So you got to find what value of K1, you know, K0 is given, and we've stuck in a fiscal sustainability rule, so we're going to be well behaved as far as government debt, but we got to make sure the capital stock is well behaved in the long run, and that requires finding the value of K1 such that the sequence of capital stocks converge to a steady state. Okay. Calibration. Okay, so got to be this. You could go on in a great deal of detail, so I'll try to kind of go through a bit fast. So we're using as our population, working age population between the ages of 20 and 69. We use actual values for 1981 to 2010, and then projections from 2011 to 2050, and then we just assume the population is constant after 2050. Population is actually decreasing through most of this forecasted period. I mean, it is decreasing through the forecasted period. And then we just assume it's constant after 2050. We have empirical data on hours worked, which we've normalized so that we can think of it as a fraction of weekly hours. If 98 is the, is a sort of a constant normalization there to discretionary number of hours available per week. We make some adjustments to the national income accounts following Hayashi and Prescott. Basically, we're treating Japan as a closed economy for these purposes, and so we add things like net exports and net factor payments from abroad to investment. Okay, as I already mentioned, public health expenditures are included in government consumption in Japan. Transfers are the social benefit other those in kind, which, like health services, which are included in GT. Transfers also, you subtract out net indirect taxes. Now, this last thing is kind of, this may come up later. We get too much revenue because we're assuming constant tax rates. We're going to take constant tax rates, say a measure of the average marginal tax rate on labor income, for example. And the problem is we're ignoring things like deductions and exemptions. So what we'll end up getting is too much revenue from these tax rates that we'll measure from the data. I'm sort of telling this, I guess, in the wrong order. I haven't told you about the tax rates yet. But so there shouldn't be really any debt problem. Well, or as much of a debt problem. But the problem is, so what we do is we take 8.1% of output and add that to transfers to reflect all the deductions and exemptions that people are getting so that our revenue numbers come out right over the sample period, 1981 to 2010. And then we just keep that 8.1% forecasting into the future. Okay, so here are the tax rates. So we have for labor tax rates, we use average marginal labor income tax rates as estimated by these two Japanese guys, Gunji and Miyazaki. And what we do is the last value that they gave us is for 2007. And we just, for our base calibration, we just say, okay, the tax rate stays at that level forever after 2007. For the capital income tax rate, we followed the methodology of Hayashi and Prescott. And that gave us values up through 2010, because through how far our data set goes. And then again, we use the last value and hold it constant beyond that point. Consumption tax. There was no consumption tax until 1989. In 1989, Japan introduced a 3%. They don't like consumption taxes. They're politically unpopular in Japan. In 1989, they introduced a consumption tax of 3%. Then they raised it to 5% in 1997. And they've already decided to raise it again in 2014 to 8%. So we know this is going to happen. And then it's going to go to 10% in 2015. And so then we'll assume in our base calibration that stays there, okay? The tax rate on bond interest, that's been about 20%, and that's been constant through time. So that's 20%, and we don't change it. Okay, so there's our tax rates. You can see that the capital income tax rate has come down over the period, and the consumption tax, of course, has been going up, and labor tax has been roughly constant. So we measure TFP from the data, given data on output, which is our sort of modified GNP measure, and our measure of capital and labor, and we assume a capital income share of 0.378, which is the average value of that from during our sample. And Then we can compute the growth rates or growth factors of TFP over the sample period, and we assume beyond 2010 that the growth rate of TFP is just constant at 1.5% per year. And again, the depreciation rate is constant, held constant. We just took the average value of the depreciation rate over our sample period. Then we have a few preference parameters we need to come up with values for. This mu, which was that it's sort of the detrended constant associated with that thing that we added to bonds in the utility function. We set that equal to 1.1. That's just to try to get the volatility of bond prices observed in the data and what we get from the model to be about the same. And then we took this value 0.5 for the Frisch elasticity of labor. Okay, and then we use equilibrium conditions to kind of back out a time series in some sense for the discount factor alpha, which is the weight on hours worked in the utility function, and phi, which was the weight on bonds in the utility function. And then use those equilibrium conditions to kind of back out a time series and take the average and hold it constant for the whole. These are not time-varying parameters. We just take the average and it's constant for all time. For the bond price, we have, there's lots of different kinds of bonds with different maturity dates and all sorts of things. We have just one kind of bond with one price. There's nothing directly observable about that, so we have to make up our own measure of the bond price, and this is how we do it. We just take the value of real bonds issued. FT is the GMP deflator, and then we divide that by what you'll receive from those bonds. You'll get back your principal. You'll receive some interest payments the next period, so you deflate by the next period's GMP deflator, and that's what we use for our empirical measure of the bond price. This isn't a good model of bond prices. What this shows you is the red line is that empirical measure of bond prices, and these other lines are the bond prices we actually get out of our model through the sample period that we're looking at. And this just shows you what would happen if phi was equal to 0. So you'd have a lower bond price, a higher rate of return. By putting that phi parameter in utility function, it increases the bond price and therefore the rate of return that people receive on bonds. Okay, this shows it in terms of rate of return. So we have before tax rate of return on bonds and before tax rate of return on capital, and they're kind of moving around because both tax rates are moving around as well as other things. If we look at the after tax, of course, then we're netting out the effects of tax changes, and so then the after tax rate of return on bonds and after tax rate of return on capital follow each other, and there's just a gap, which is the interest premium, that the rate of return premium you get on capital relative to bonds, because you like these bonds. Okay, that just summarizes those parameter values. Okay, what about the fiscal sustainability rule? So we have to decide what is going to be bar here is our detrended bonds. And, or actually detrended, it's the bond to output ratio in steady state, sorry. B bar is the bond to output ratio in steady state, and we take that to be 0.6, completely arbitrary. But the idea is that since we have these people liking bonds, there's going to be some bonds in our steady state, so they'll continue to be making interest payments over the long run. They have to bring it down to some level. We'll bring it down to 60% of GMP. And then we consider 3 possible values of B max. Actually, we were working on it. These 3 values kept on marching to higher levels as Japanese debt kept on increasing over time. So this was really a moving target for us, and probably will continue to be. So our kind of base level is 250%. We think that's the level at which you got to do something. You got to start bringing the debt down. You can't sustain bond to output ratio of 250%. But we also look at 200% and we also look at 300%. And like I said, Japan's already approaching 150%, so it's getting up there. And then there's going to be a different value of kappa. That's this fraction of the debt that has to be paid back once that Bmax has been hit, once that trigger's been hit, and how do we figure out what kappa should be? Okay, so this shows you how we got kappa. So let's pick a kappa, okay? Let's pick a kappa of 0.05. If you pick a kappa of 0.05, the trigger here gets hit in 2020, but 0.05 is too small. Debt to output continues to rise. And it's only after 2050 that it would start to come down because after that point the growth in expenditures has settled down. If we raise it, say, to 15 to 0.15, well, then what happens is, okay, sure, you bring the debt to output down, but you do so, this is the revenue, this is in terms of what we call the consumption tax equivalent revenue requirement. That's the D divided by consumption. D was the debt that had to be paid back, and then you normalize that, divide that by consumption, so you can think of it as a fraction of consumption. If you make kappa too high, then you're forcing people to pay more than they would need to stabilize the debt. So what we did is we found the kappa that was sort of the smallest kappa you could get away with that brought the debt to output ratio down. That was sort of how we implemented this. And then this shows what happens to debt to output under those different Bmaxes. So this is the green line is if Bmax were 200%, 250%, or 300%. Okay, and then we have different values of kappa. 0.12, 0.1, or 0.087 are the values of kappa that we found for those different Bmaxes. And this is what happens to the consumption tax. So the longer you wait, the more debt you have, the more you have to tax in order to pay back, in order to bring that debt down. So the consumption tax equivalent revenue requirement marches up. You delay the sort of day of reckoning, but when it comes, it's more costly. Okay? And you're looking at values over 30% of consumption. Okay? Those values are between 30 and about 37% of consumption. Okay. So here's how our model performs over the sample period. And it's hours worked. Okay, so there's a couple deviations or some ways in which the model does quite well. This one is something that we missed, that we sort of knew we were going to miss. Okay, there's been this reduction in hours worked in Japan over this period that we're not capturing. Our model doesn't capture. Hayashi and Prescott captured that by, there was some restriction on the number of hours worked that was implemented by Japan that brought the number of hours worked per person down over time in that period. I believe that there's also a paper by Brown, Ikeda, and Joins that looks at the savings rate in Japan, and they used an overlapping generations model, and they got it just because of changes in the family size over this period, and that seemed to be enough to get the reduction in hours worked per person. Capital stock we get pretty well. GMP we get pretty well over this period. Consumption we get well. Investment we miss on a bit. What's happening here? Our model overpredicts the level of investment. What are we probably abstracting from here? The depreciation rate's been declining in Japan. We assumed the average depreciation rate over our sample period. There's actually been a shift towards types of capital that have lower depreciation rates in Japan, and so our model, because we have the higher depreciation rate, our model is over-predicting investment relative to what we observe in the data due to that assumption. Capital output ratio looks okay. So this is the bond output ratio that we get. Remember, bonds are endogenous in our model, so what we have is for the bond to output ratio in the data is, and the model, question is, we start off, of course, exactly right, because we assume the initial bond level is what it is in the data, so that by definition we're right in 1981. And then what we did is, remember that 8.1% that we did? Well, we essentially picked that so that we were about right at the end. And, you know, there's some deviation in the middle, but the idea is what we're trying to do is use this to forecast forward, so we thought it was important to be pretty close to correct at the end. And so that's how we, you know, how we did that. So this would be the data, the model, and anyway, so, okay, now, if we want to think about using distorting taxes to retire the debt, first of all, what we thought about was, I said, okay, we know how much needs to be funded in the steady state, and that's going to be a lot more than is funded now because of the increase in transfers and government expenditures that are forecasted. So this is just sort of a steady state kind of Laffer curve. Okay? So as you increase the consumption tax rate, this is the revenue that you're getting from that increase in consumption taxes added to the revenue. The other taxes are constant, you know, so that's still sitting there. And then as you increase the consumption tax rate, you get more revenue. And you can see here's what the steady state G plus TR is, and you can see then you need a consumption tax of a bit over 40% in order to, in the steady state. If all you were going to do was increase the consumption tax, if all you were going to do is increase the consumption tax, you would need to increase it a lot. Remember, politically, consumption taxes are not popular in Japan, so they wouldn't like that. Use a labor tax. Well, if you're going to use a labor tax all by itself, you can't do it. You can't do it because you have this, the famous, what do you call that? Inverse U-shaped Laffer curve for the labor tax rate, and the maximum revenue, additional revenue you can get from the labor tax isn't enough to fund the steady state expenditures. So you can't do it just with labor tax alone. If you are going to do this, it's going to have to be either using the consumption tax by itself or a combination of the consumption tax and the labor tax. We haven't yet experimented with, and probably will. This is still, you know, we still have some things to do here. But with the capital tax, nobody would think about using the capital tax, increasing the capital tax as a way of being able to pay for this stuff, because that's very distorting. But what would happen if you actually reduce the capital tax rate? You know, maybe that would give you enough stimulus. I'm not sure where we are on the Laffer curve with the capital tax, so that's something we should take a look at. But at this point, we're just experimenting with the labor tax and consumption tax rate. We can also, you know, there's a sense in which capital taxes and labor taxes are kind of the same. They distort the same margin. And in particular, the wedge, the tax wedge that affects the first order condition has this form. You have 1 minus the labor tax rate in the numerator, 1 plus the consumption tax rate in the denominator. If I solve for this sort of effective tax rate or whatever, it's going to be tau C plus tau H divided by 1 plus tau C. Okay? And so in some sense, you can see why to get some revenue, when you increase tau H, you're increasing this effective wedge. When you increase tau C, well, you're increasing the numerator, but you know, you're decreasing it because of increasing the denominator as well. So here's what happens. So look at this. So let's suppose we were going to use a combination of labor tax and, because you can't use just a labor tax, let's suppose you're going to use a combination of the labor tax and the consumption tax to try to finance this steady state. So this is not a Laffer curve. This is just combinations of consumption tax rates and labor tax rates that balance the budget in the steady state. That balance the budget in steady state. What does that say? Well, to balance the budget in steady state, I could have a very high consumption. The vertical axis is the consumption tax rate. I could have a very high consumption tax rate, or that's not. Anyway, I could have a very high consumption tax rate, or I could raise the labor income tax rate along the horizontal axis and reduce the consumption tax rate. And then eventually, though, if I try to shift too much into the labor tax, I'm on that downward portion of the labor tax Laffer curve, and I would have to have I wouldn't be giving up consumption tax. I would actually have to raise the consumption tax in order to get the right amount of revenue. And this shows what happens to that effective tax rate as we move along here. As you shift away from consumption tax to the labor income tax rate, you're just making the distortion worse, okay? You're monotonically making the distortion worse. And so what this says is that, well, if you were, you could use a tax rate, you get the consumption tax rate pretty low if you're willing to put up with a labor income tax rate of around 70%, but not likely. Okay, so the way we implement, when we think about over the transition path, okay, so that was just steady state stuff I was looking at there. So if we're looking at over the transition path and we have to retire the debt, so we have to actually pay more over the transition path, because over the transition path you got to retire the debt as well as worry about these increased expenditures. So we have the same kind of sort of fiscal sustainability rule. So what we're going to assume is that you hold the tax rate as whatever it is in the data, the last value when we held it constant at the last value that was observed, as long as the debt to output ratio has never reached this trigger level. Once it's reached the trigger level, you go to the steady state, the corresponding steady state tax rate, plus some increment pi to pay down the debt. That's if you've reached the trigger, that the bond to output ratio has reached Bmax for some period before the period t that you're looking at, and the bond to output ratio is still above the bond to output ratio that you're targeting for your steady state, which is B bar, okay? Which is 0.6 for us, 60% for us. Then, eventually, the bond to output ratio will get below B bar, at which point you revert just to the steady state tax rate, and then you'll just, hone in on that steady state and stay there. Okay, and again, we choose pi then to be the smallest increment that basically causes the bond to output ratio to fall, okay? I say here, leads to activation of the second trigger. I mean, that's the way it's programmed, but basically you have to get to the point where eventually the bond to output ratio reaches B bar, okay? So here's what, suppose we just did it with a consumption tax. If we did it with a consumption tax, and we held the labor income tax rate constant, what happens is, okay, so the consumption tax is going along at the planned and not forecasted, but legislated values. And then you reach the trigger. Before 2020, about 2019, you reach the trigger. And then the consumption tax goes up to about 60%. It stays at 60% until the debt to output ratio has been brought below 60%, and then you revert to a steady state tax rate on consumption. Okay, that was one experiment. How much time do I have? 4 or 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, so I mean, so these are, we did one other experiment. We said, okay, if you can't put up with that kind of consumption, what would it look like if when the trigger was hit, we raised both the consumption tax and the labor tax? And this is pretty arbitrary. We'll be doing some more experiments, hopefully that, are a little bit more motivated. But this is basically what we did here is we said, okay, the trigger gets hit, raise the labor income tax rate to 45%. How much you have to raise the consumption tax in that case? To about 50%. And then that goes along, and then you go to a steady state consumption tax rate. Keep that labor tax rate at 45%, and you'll end up with a steady state consumption tax of about 38%. Okay. Then we said, okay, well, what if you did what if the tax rate that you temporarily raised was a labor income tax rate? So what you did is you go along at the observed values up until the trigger gets hit, and you go along at the observed values of the labor tax until the trigger gets hit. When you use the labor tax as your trigger, it delays the day of reckoning. If you looked at the last one, it was like about 2018 or 2019 or something. This delays it because people are working harder because they know in the future they're going to be taxed a lot. So they work harder, and that delays the day of reckoning a little bit. But then you end up raising the labor income tax rate. So again, what I did is I assumed a 40% raise in consumption tax at the time that at the time the trigger is hit, and the labor income tax rate goes up to about 60% temporarily, and then comes back down to a steady state one of a little over about 41%. So you could end up with a steady state where the capital income tax rate, labor income tax rate are both close to 40%, but in the period that you're having to pay down the debt, if you use the labor tax, you'd have to raise an additional 20% in order to bring down the debt. Far better to do that with a consumption tax, because it would be less and less distorting. Okay, these are bad pictures, and this just shows what happens over that transition period to endogenous variables. The only thing I think I'll point out, because these are not easy to see and not very informative the way they're done right now, but if you look at the labor input, of course, these taxes are distorting, and there will be a reduction in the labor input associated with these higher tax rates, in particular in the green experiment, which is the one where you really raise the labor tax rate over that transition period. That would reduce hours worked, labor input by 17%. Okay. Consumption is also reduced over the transition period due to this distortion. Okay. Here's what happens to the tax distortion. So this is a way you can kind of rank all these things in terms of welfare. They're all designed to raise basically the same, to deal with the same revenue needs, but you're using different combinations of tax rates. Obviously, if you use that lump sum where you just reduce the transfers, okay, the effective tax rate just stays constant. That tau just stays constant over that transition period. But if you use the distorting taxes, well, if you use only the consumption tax, that involves raising the distortion by as little as possible. Use the labor income tax rate to deal with the paying down the debt, that raises that distortion by the most. Difference being, if you use a labor tax rate, you get to delay a bit the day of reckoning. Okay. Okay. So conclusion. So the way we're interpreting this, a soaring debt to GMP ratio in Japan implies a kind of fiscal day of reckoning that should happen soon, around 2020. Based on the values of BY max that we assumed. These are arbitrary. You could think it's something different, and we could put it in the model, and we could tell you when it would happen. Okay, it's sort of like, it's a we could give this to the Japanese government; they could play with it. So the costs of the aging population require a large, nearly permanent increase in tax rates. Consumption, if you use the consumption tax, a permanent increase to 48%. With an additional 12% required during the transition period, if that was the best case scenario, where you use the consumption tax. If you can use both the consumption and labor tax, permanent increase to about 40% with a smaller additional increase during the consumption tax during the transition. Of course, these things all look very grim. Other things that should be explored. Number one, and I think we'll explore this one in the same paper, broaden the tax base. What's that 8.1%? That should be possible to kind of collect that revenue without raising marginal tax rates. That's the way we're interpreting that. So what would the problem look like if we were to collect that 8.1%? And other options include reforms, like reforming Social Security or their health insurance programs, public health programs. The other thing is you could try to deal with the aging problem more directly, encourage fertility, encourage immigration, another big political problem in Japan. That would be something that they're not ready to accept, but would certainly mitigate the problem to some extent. Encouraging female labor force participation, that does get discussed. They are very actively trying to do that. And then, of course, well, I guess it's the same thing as the reforms, is just to reduce spending. But anyway, that's what I have.
So we still have time for a few questions from the audience.
It's on good. This is sort of a rich problem area. Very complicated. What about getting people to work longer? Of course, you had the woman working, which is good. Men should not have to work so much. Overnight, Japan put a 30% copay on their medical insurance, or not medical insurance, but medical plans. Some countries have started to index. What about endogenizing that work life? I guess that's going to require going to overlapping.
No, I think what you're thinking about is when do people choose to retire and how that might affect...
Yeah, a lot of the transfers are to the old people who have retired in the U.S. and other countries. I suppose Japan,
yeah.
They had that demographic bulge.
Yeah. No, it's actually the case that we started this project using overlapping generations. Why did we decided? We thought this would be very easy. It's still been hard, but we decided to do a first stab with the standard infinite horizon model, and partly because if you look at those projections, say that they kind of stay constant or don't come back down for so long that we thought, well, with overlapping generations we would get the full effect of this sort of demographic sort of transition. However, yeah, what you're raising is another issue, which is life cycle kind of decisions that people can make in response to the situation that they face that could lead to mitigating could lead to improving the quantitative situation.
Yeah, maybe increase the labor supply.
Yeah, okay. That's a good point.
Well, I'd like to first of all congratulate you because you did a fantastic job. Your presentation is very, very good. Your model is quite complex, but we can understand it. But I'm thinking about Japan in terms of a country which has stopped a little bit in its GDP development. Its increase hasn't been so good in the last years. And what we have there is an example of how to push up the taxes. So taxes, instead of being friendly, they would be exactly the contrary. Japan reminds me nowadays Fukushima. Japan reminds me the necessity of expanding really some expenses, but at the same time to be extremely careful because you have their really recessions. You have their problems. And when you push up these taxes up, then we have a nightmare. This population is getting older and older. The capacity to consume with more taxes would be lowered. So what is just somehow pushing me to make a question is, how could you solve this paradox? In the middle of the Asian countries, some of them are doing quite well. Japan is not doing well. And then your proposition is to study taxes going up. Excuse me, but I'd like to know your reasoning about that.
Well, first of all, I'm not saying that obviously other alternatives should be explored. I mean, these tax increases would be devastating. There's no question. They would be devastating. It would be an act of suicide for the Japanese economy. The problem is, at some point, they have to do something. And there's a list of reforms that we talked about here that could be explored. But I think what this does basically, the reaction that you have is exactly the reaction we want people to have. The idea is this is a serious problem. We should all be looking at ways that Japan can bring their fiscal situation in order without having to destroy its economy. And perhaps this is a perfect foresight world we're dealing with. Perhaps a lot of the problems that Japan faces has to do with the fact that they're not sure how they're going to deal with these problems. And bad things of this sort, or at least working in this direction, are likely on the horizon for them, and that's a problem.
So what about unorthodox solution to the debt, inflation? I don't mean very high inflation, but just...
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't have inflation in the model, but that would be equivalent to default from the point of view of this model. It would be Japan could default on the debt. The fact that that debt sells at such a low discount, I don't know. We interpret that as meaning people don't think Japan would ever do that. So we're not considering that as a possibility. Obviously, if we enrich the structure, we could think about that. But that's not something that. Latin American countries could never ever get debt to output ratios at that level because people have a different expectation.
Hi, Gary. Quick question. So what actually happened in a lot of after the Asian currency crisis and in certain South American countries, they used inflation not so much only for the debt, but to reduce the real value of spending. Right? You just basically have inflation, but you don't change the salaries of the government employees, teachers, people who are on fixed pensions, and you effectively achieve a reduction in spending. So the question is, how sensitive would things be to that avenue rather than explicitly defaulting on the debt? But many countries have done exactly that. That's how they achieve balance after a crisis. Then the other question is, do you have some sensitivity of what would have to happen to immigration? Like, how sensitive are the calculations to the low fertility rates?
No, we haven't. Both are good points. I don't really have an answer to either. We don't, we haven't modeled inflation and the role that inflation might play in this kind of environment. But in particular, there's certainly been work done on the fiscal effects of immigration by people like Storis Latin, and there's certainly been discussion about doing work like that for Japan. It hasn't been done.
So if there's no further question, I'd like to thank the speakers, and we're going to have a coffee break.